Hi, everyone. I'm Dennis Fisher, and I'm here with my friend Silas Cutler from the Census research team to talk about the Silk Typhoon indictments and research from Microsoft that came out this week. Silas, I know this is something that you track pretty closely. You spend a lot of time thinking about and watching APT groups and monitoring their behavior. What was your initial thought when you saw the MS-TIC research that came out yesterday and also the indictments from the Department of Justice?
Yeah. So anytime there's a new announcement of a threat actor group from Microsoft, it turns into one of those halt everything and immediately start investigating because it's going to be something interesting. It may not always be highly actionable, but it kind of feels like every few months now when Microsoft puts out something, it's kind of like a little scavenger hunt where there's a new actor to kind of merge into the broader universe of threat actor groups that we know. And um, yeah, this is really cool, and it's nice to see Hafnium finally graduated from the old naming system of Microsoft to Silk Typhoon now.
Yeah, the naming conventions is a whole other separate like 9 hour podcast we could do at some point, but it's one of those things that drives me crazy as a journalist, like trying to track them all.
You got to have a
Um,
Rosetta Stone, like some Excel sheet that just maps all the names. Like Florian created the OG one at this point.
I,
I think Florian. So
yeah, I've seen a couple. It would be helpful. So, in terms of the indictments themselves, when you look at those, we've seen a lot of these, specifically in probably the last 4 or 5 years, against some Russian actors, some Iranian actors, North Korean actors, and Chinese actors. And I always look at those and think, okay, this is a good step. I like that we're doing this, but does it actually mean anything in the broader picture? These people are never going to come to the US and get arrested unless they make some huge mistake with their travel itineraries. Is this just one of those things where it's sending a message and saying, we know who you are, we know where you are, we know what you're doing,
that's
we're
a good
paying
question.
attention?
That's a good question. So like we always talk about that angle, like how much is it actually affecting the actor? Um, and the truth is like there's the stories of threat actors from Russia and ransomware gangs where it's like this is your employee of the month poster now. But I'll actually frame it in kind of a different way, which is the effect it has on the research community. I see as being an overall outstandingly positive one. When one of these indictments comes out, it's a really great opportunity for researchers to kind of walk through the analysis, and even like the Flax Typhoon one, I remember really closely and well because like they outlined like finding information about the company behind the attacks based on like patent filings, and that's such a cool like trick, and it's a great opportunity for researchers to go out and try and find that patent itself. Like if that's not something you've ever done as part of like threat analysis work of like how would I find a patent, like a Chinese patent, um, it gives a really cool research path. And so even for researchers, it's good opportunities to explore new areas where they can look for things that may be helpful for attribution. Um, but it also essentially defines the reputation of those threat actors going forward. So if any of the actors from an indictment starts working on a new project, researchers are going to be following them. So in some ways, it may not be something where we can easily measure the effects that it has on the actor, but we can measure ourselves and see, hey, this has had an effort where now, if this person who has historically written tools for like the Chinese Ministry of State Security, MSS, puts out something on GitHub, we're all going to be looking at it now to better understand. And if it's perfectly benign, great, more power to them. But if they're starting to build tools, it just means we're going to have fingerprints that much faster.
That's a really good point. I had never really considered it from that sort of lens, looking at it from, say your perspective, where you're tracking these groups, you're tracking these individuals and looking for patterns in their behavior, right? You want to
Mm-hmm.
see what they're doing on a daily basis or a monthly basis, maybe what their tool production is, what their targeting might be. Is that changing? Why is that changing? Is there any like a geopolitical answer for that? Is there an economic answer? Or is it just they got bored and decided to start poking around over here? I guess there's a whole grab bag of things to consider with that.
Oh yeah, and there are enough questions that it's difficult to answer in this space that this is one of those areas where we can. There's really easy ways to find good answers from these. So being able to teach essentially how to do research as well is one of the cool things that comes out of this.
Yeah. So the another thing that always strikes me with these indictments, specifically, I guess, with the Chinese actors, is the way that a lot of these groups and tend to overlap. We always see at the end of a threat intelligence report some language that says this activity overlaps with a cluster that another company defines as this, but they're not one-to-one comparisons. So please be careful, making those statements or things like that. So when you're looking at, say APT 27, which is one of the groups mentioned in these indictments, how hard is it to sort of wrap your arms around that and say, we know who APT 27 is, but instead of like, maybe some of these guys are in it, maybe they're in another group too, maybe they overlap, maybe they play together sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, so it really depends on the approach that you're taking towards that analysis. So if you're starting with, I'm going to work from the indictment where I know that these individuals with these handles are associated with the activity, that gets really difficult to try. Like that's where it's easier to see that person A may not directly be involved, but may have just been maybe there was somebody that one of the other people had linked to their blog numerous times, and there was tech overlap and transfer through that. Um, when you're looking at it though from the I'm starting from an intrusion and working upwards, it's a lot harder to kind of see the differences in those connections. You may see it in terms of like, hey, there's code differences between what we're seeing at the proxy level where they may be using a couple of different proxy tools, but everything else in their toolkit follows the same similar coding style or has all been designed to work together. That proxy side tends to be an outlier. Um, and even Microsoft kind of talked a little bit, I think, about this because there's some proxy tunneling tool, mtran, unless I'm getting my sets mixed up, uh, that this group was using. And htran years ago, back from the early 2010s, was a same same type of proxy tool, but that one was just written by somebody as part of their broader China Eagles hacking group that many of the people in APT1 and several of the other groups were part of as individuals, and they just sort of borrowed that tooling off the shelf to use as part of their day job.
That that's a funny thing that always strikes me in these too is you think about these APT groups as, sort of the apex predators. They have all these resources at their disposal. They have funding, they have backing, they have political cover, that sort of thing. They can develop their own tools. They're doing original, vulnerability research and exploit development, but they also might just grab something from some dude's GitHub and be like, he's already done the work. Why don't we just go and use this too? So just seeing somebody use some off the shelf tool doesn't mean there's some commodity cyber criminal. It could be APT 27 that was just like, somebody already did the work for us. Let's use their stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And just pulling tools like it sounds like they're not putting the effort in, but just pulling tools off the shelf in places like GitHub sometimes offer way significant advantages to writing their own tools. And if they're writing their own tools, like they can add in whatever functionality they need specific to things, and they can have. I guess really they don't get all that much more granular control because if you're just pulling an open source tool, you can make the same modifications as you like. Um, but they get the added benefit of a tool not being exclusive to them. And for
Yeah.
years, with a lot of the Chinese APT groups, like we tracked, the Perpy malware, and it had a unique set of decoding mechanisms for the strings. Um, and that was how we consistently found their tools. And even when they forked a copy of Mimikatz, they still used the same string obfuscation, but that same code was able to continuously be used to track them, honestly, from like 2008 to 2015. So by pulling something off the shelf, it avoids those long-term dirty fingerprints that some of these actors leave and does make it a lot harder to track them. That
Yeah.
also coupled with a lot of this exploitation moving from we're going to send phishing emails to we're just going to use a web exploit that we also got off GitHub or is available in Metasploit.
Yeah. In terms of the attribution part of this, there's very obvious benefits for the US government to put out these indictments and say, you know, we know who you 12 people are. We know what you're doing. We know who you're doing it for. That sort of thing. That, we understand what that's for. How much do people in the research community and even say network defenders really care who's doing bad things to them? I mean, for researchers, yes, you want to track them like you explained and see
Mhm.
who's doing what. But, if you're a network defender, how much do you really care that, group A is doing it instead of group B?
So in terms of mitigation planning and how you respond to incidents, it becomes really important. But that doesn't necessarily, it's not as important at the country level. Knowing it's the difference between something like scattered spider versus Silk Typhoon, major differences in how you'd respond. Um, yeah, but I mean, I hear a lot of times people talk about individual attribution doesn't matter, country attribution doesn't matter, and quite often they're right because unless you're going to be taking it to a legal team that's going to take it to court, it has a like deteriorating value. I often go to a lot of these sort of like soft power values of it as well, like knowing that it's these 8 people in an office, the isoon office, like that's helpful from the like morale perspective of knowing, okay, there's a human at the other end of the other end of the wire, we're in this back and forth fighting together against each other. Like that has some benefit for defenders in terms of helping the zeitgeist of it all move forward. But I also like I think it's important for some of the like broad backstop parts of the analysis. So for example, if there's a set of activity that a defender is watching, they see consistent elements that look like something originating from various IoT devices targeting their network. They're seeing a lot of the tradecraft that looks like something like Silk Typhoon that they'd read about in a blog post. The slight gut analysis of like this feels like it's probably Chinese is a good like base point, because then if all of a sudden you start to see successful intrusion and then them drop something like a ransomware payload from Lockbit, that helps understand like, is this the same set of activity? And those like these are types of things that may not necessarily be for on paper attribution and for final assessments, but that's underlying gut check for researchers of knowing this feels like what I expect from a Chinese set, helps at least guide them along their way and helps build up that sort of native internal intuition.
That's a great point. I imagine you also have to be careful not to sort of get yourself locked into those kind of assumptions and be like, oh, I saw this with that one Chinese actor. It's definitely a Chinese actor again.
Yes, I mean that is of course the great risk of it. Like you should always trust your gut, but you should also trust that your gut is going to betray you in these things, and that and actors make incredibly cool choices at times. And I remember when Olympic Destroyer hit, and in the like hours that happened afterwards, there was people were tearing apart the PE headers and immediately going to, hey, the order in which these are placed, this matches this Russian set. Um, but then there were indications that no, it's potentially code borrowed from some North Korean malware, and so that immediate aftermath is always a fun time.
Yeah, that one, that 24 to 48 hours was a wild time
Yeah, and
for sure.
it's also important because it's also that time where people do get that. No, I believe completely that this is this set because this tool returned PE
Yeah,
header hash number this. Um, yeah, it's an easy pitfall to make. Incredibly fun times. But
yeah,
yeah,
awesome. All right, well, Silas, thanks so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
yeah, happy to help.
Take care.